I watched my wife Sarah walk into that HOA meeting with nothing but a leather briefcase and a calm smile. Corinne Mitchell sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, surrounded by her board members who looked ready for war. The room felt electric with tension. I knew Sarah had been planning something for months, but I had no idea what. Then Corinne stood up, her face red with rage, and screamed at my wife to sit down and shut up. That is when Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. She placed it on the table and pressed record. "Please continue," Sarah said quietly. "I want to make sure we get everything on the record." Corinne's eyes went wide. She reached for her phone and dialed 911. That is when I realized my wife had been setting the perfect trap all along. 3 months earlier, Sarah and I had moved into our dream home in Willowbrook Estates. The community looked like something from a magazine. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and tree-lined streets that curved through the neighborhood like rivers of peace. We thought we had found paradise. Sarah had just retired from her job as a corporate lawyer. After 20 years of fighting legal battles for Fortune 500 companies, she wanted to focus on our family and enjoy the quiet life we had always dreamed of. She was brilliant, strategic, and had a mind that could spot legal problems from miles away. But she was tired of the corporate world and ready for something different. The HOA seemed friendly at first. Corinne Mitchell, the association president, even brought us cookies during our first week. She was a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She told us about the community guidelines and how everyone worked together to keep property values high. "We just want to maintain standards," Corinne said sweetly. "Nothing too strict, just basic rules to keep things nice." Those basic rules turned out to be a 40-page document filled with regulations about everything from grass height to the exact shade of paint allowed on front doors. Sarah read through every single page while I unpacked boxes. I should have paid more attention to the look on her face as she studied those rules. The first violation notice arrived 2 weeks later. Our mailbox was apparently the wrong shade of black. Corinne had measured the exact color against some official HOA chart and determined we were in violation. The fine was $50. Sarah just smiled and paid the fine, but I noticed she started taking pictures of everything. Our mailbox, our neighbors' mailboxes, the HOA office, even Corinne herself walking through the neighborhood with her clipboard and measuring tape. "What are you doing?" I asked one evening as I watched Sarah photograph another violation notice. "Research," she said calmly, "just research." More notices followed. Our grass was half an inch too tall. Our welcome mat was not an approved color. We had left our garbage cans visible from the street for 20 minutes longer than allowed. Each violation came with a fine and a stern letter about maintaining community standards. Other neighbors started avoiding us. I learned later that speaking to people who were in violation could result in harassment charges from the HOA. Corinne had created a system where fear kept everyone silent and isolated. But Sarah never seemed worried. She paid every fine without complaint and continued her documentation process. She spent hours on her laptop, researching state laws and HOA regulations. She printed documents and organized them in color-coded folders. She made phone calls to government offices and took detailed notes about every conversation. "Honey, what exactly are you planning?" I asked one night as she worked at the kitchen table surrounded by legal papers. Sarah looked up at me with the same smile she used to wear when she was about to destroy an opponent in court. "I am going to solve our HOA problem," she said quietly, "permanently." "How?" By giving them exactly what they want, she said. A fight. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had seen that look before, back when Sarah was still practicing law. It was the look she got when she had found the perfect angle to win a case that everyone else thought was hopeless. Sarah, what are you planning? She closed her laptop and reached across the table to take my hand. Trust me, she said. Corinne Mitchell thinks she is dealing with just another scared homeowner. She has no idea who she is really fighting. That night, Sarah stayed up until dawn making phone calls and filling out forms. I fell asleep to the sound of her fingers typing on the keyboard and her quiet voice speaking to people on the other end of long-distance calls. I woke up the next morning to find her already dressed and ready for the day. She was wearing her old business suit, the one she used to wear to court. Her briefcase sat by the front door, packed and ready. Today is the day, she said simply. I had no idea that my wife was about to turn our suburban nightmare into Corinne Mitchell's worst legal nightmare. The HOA war against our family escalated quickly after that first month. Corinne Mitchell seemed to take our compliance as a sign of weakness rather than cooperation. She started targeting us with violations that other neighbors ignored completely. I watched our next-door neighbor Bob leave his garbage cans out for 3 days straight without getting a single notice. Meanwhile, we received a violation for leaving ours out for 2 hours past the pickup time. The double standard was obvious and intentional. Corinne began conducting surprise inspections of our property. She would arrive unannounced with a clipboard and measuring tape, walking around our yard like a detective gathering evidence. She measured our grass height, examined our mailbox paint, and took photos of anything she could claim was a violation. This is harassment, I told Sarah after Corinne's third surprise visit in 1 week. Yes, it is, Sarah agreed calmly. She was sitting at her laptop typing notes about the inspection, and it is exactly what we need. The violation notices became more creative and absurd. We were cited for having a garden hose visible from the street. Our front door wreath was allegedly too large according to HOA guidelines. Even our doormat was reportedly positioned 2 inches outside the approved zone. Each notice came with increasingly aggressive language. Corinne stopped pretending to be friendly. Her letters now included phrases like immediate compliance required and serious consequences for continued violations. The fines grew larger with each infraction. Other neighbors started crossing the street to avoid talking to us. I learned from quiet conversations that Corinne had previously destroyed families who challenged her authority. The Johnsons had been forced to sell their home after Corinne fined them into bankruptcy over landscaping violations. The Martinez family had given up fighting after Corinne called Child Protective Services, claiming their children were unsupervised. Fear ruled Willowbrook estates like a disease. Everyone knew Corinne was abusing her power, but nobody dared speak up. She had created a perfect system of intimidation, where victims stayed silent to avoid becoming targets. The turning point came when Corinne hired private security guards to patrol the neighborhood. 2 men in uniform started driving through our community in a white SUV with Willowbrook Security painted on the sides. They parked outside houses of residents who had violations and watched like prison guards. This is insane, I said to Sarah as we watched the security vehicle parked across from our house. She has turned our neighborhood into a police state. Sarah was taking photos of the security guards through our living room window. Her face showed no emotion, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. Perfect, she said quietly. This is absolutely perfect. The security guards started trespassing on our property to conduct their own inspections. They walked through our backyard without permission, looking for violations Karen could use against us. When I confronted them, they claimed they had authority under HOA bylaws to inspect any property for compliance issues. Sarah documented everything, every trespass, every illegal inspection, every aggressive letter. She recorded phone conversations and kept detailed logs of every interaction with Karen and her security team. Then came the letter that changed everything. Karen demanded that Sarah appear at an emergency HOA board meeting to answer for our serious and ongoing violations. The letter stated that failure to appear would result in immediate legal action and possible foreclosure proceedings. "She cannot foreclose on our house over a mailbox color," I said, reading the letter with disbelief. "No, she cannot," Sarah agreed. "But she does not know that, and more importantly, she is about to make some very serious legal mistakes." Sarah accepted the meeting demand immediately. She called Karen that same day and confirmed she would attend the emergency session. Her voice was polite and cooperative, but I could see something dangerous flickering in her eyes. "You are really going to face them alone?" I asked. "I have been preparing for this moment for months," Sarah said. "Karen thinks she is calling me in for punishment. She has no idea she is walking into my courtroom." That evening, Sarah spent hours preparing her briefcase. She organized documents, checked her recording equipment, and reviewed pages of notes. She looked like a general preparing for the most important battle of her career. "What happens tomorrow?" I asked as we got ready for bed. Sarah smiled that same predatory smile I had seen the night she started planning her strategy. "Tomorrow, Karen Mitchell learns the difference between real legal authority and suburban bullying," she said. "Tomorrow, the hunter becomes the hunted." I fell asleep that night with a knot in my stomach, knowing that everything was about to change. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in the community center. Sarah arrived 10 minutes early, carrying her leather briefcase and wearing the same business suit she had worn to countless corporate battles. She looked calm and professional, but I could see the intensity burning behind her eyes. The community center meeting room had been arranged like a courtroom. Karen Mitchell sat at the head of a long table with 4 other board members flanking her on both sides. They had positioned a single chair facing the table where Sarah was expected to sit. The setup was designed to intimidate, to make Sarah feel isolated and outnumbered. "Mrs. Sarah Thompson," Karen announced as Sarah entered the room, "please take your seat so we can address your violations." Sarah walked calmly to the chair and sat down. She placed her briefcase on the floor beside her and folded her hands in her lap. She looked completely at ease, as if she were attending a friendly coffee meeting rather than facing a hostile tribunal. "Before we begin," Sarah said quietly, "I want to make sure we have a complete record of this meeting." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small digital recording device. She placed it on the table directly in front of Karen and pressed the record button. The red light began blinking. Karen's confident expression faltered for just a moment. "That will not be necessary," she said quickly. "Oh, but it is," Sarah replied calmly. "I want to make sure we get everything on the record. Please continue." Board member Janet Stevens leaned forward aggressively. "You have accumulated 17 violations in 3 months," she said, reading from a thick folder. "Your blatant disregard for community standards is unacceptable. Could you please specify which state law gives you authority to fine homeowners for mailbox colors?" Sarah asked politely. Karen's face began turning red. "We do not need state law. We have HOA authority. Actually, you do need state law, Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly calm. All HOA authority must derive from legitimate legal foundations. Could you please cite the specific statute that grants you enforcement powers? The board members looked at each other uncertainly. They had never been challenged on their legal authority before. They had been operating on intimidation and fear, not actual law. We have covenants, board member Mike Chen said defensively. Yes, you do, Sarah agreed. But covenants cannot supersede state law, and state law requires specific procedures for HOA enforcement actions. Have you followed those procedures? Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You will show respect for this board, she shouted. We are the governing authority in this community. Sarah looked up at Karen with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the meeting. Please continue shouting, she said quietly. I want the recording to capture your exact words about governing authority. That was the moment Karen lost complete control. Her face turned bright red, and she began screaming about disrespect and insubordination. She waved her hands wildly and demanded that Sarah stop recording immediately. Turn that thing off right now, Karen shrieked. No, Sarah said simply. Karen grabbed her cell phone and dialed security. Get in here immediately, she barked into the phone. We have a disruptive homeowner who refuses to comply. 2 security guards entered the meeting room within seconds. They had obviously been waiting outside for Karen's signal. They positioned themselves on either side of Sarah's chair like prison guards flanking a dangerous criminal. Remove that recording device, Karen ordered the guards. Sarah looked directly at the recording device and spoke clearly. I am now being threatened by private security guards hired by the HOA board. The time is 7:23 p.m. on Thursday, October 15th. Escort her out, Karen commanded. But Sarah remained seated. She looked completely relaxed despite being surrounded by hostile board members and armed security guards. She was exactly where she wanted to be. I am not being disruptive, Sarah said calmly. I am asking legitimate questions about your legal authority. If you remove me from this meeting, you will be violating my rights as a homeowner. Karen was beyond reason now. She grabbed her phone again and dialed 911. I need police at the Willowbrook Estates Community Center immediately, she said to the emergency operator. We have a disruptive homeowner who is refusing to leave a legal meeting. Sarah's eyes lit up with satisfaction. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. 2 police officers arrived within 10 minutes. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Park entered the meeting room to find Sarah sitting calmly in her chair, while Karen paced behind the table like a caged animal. What seems to be the problem? Officer Rodriguez asked. This woman is being disruptive and refusing to follow our authority, Karen said, pointing at Sarah. She needs to be removed immediately. Officer Park looked at Sarah, who appeared to be the most peaceful person in the room. Ma'am, are you being disruptive? No, officer, Sarah said politely. I am simply asking questions about the legal basis for their enforcement actions. I would also like to file a complaint about harassment and intimidation by this HOA board. That was the moment everything shifted. Officer Rodriguez looked around the room and began to realize that something was not right about Karen's story. Officer Rodriguez asked to speak with Sarah privately. They stepped out of the meeting room and walked to a quiet corner of the community center lobby. Sarah carried her briefcase with her, and I could see through the windows that she was showing the officer documents from inside. What exactly has been happening here? Officer Rodriguez asked. Sarah opened her briefcase and began pulling out organized folders. Each folder was labeled and color-coded. She had months of documentation organized like evidence for a major court case. This folder contains photographs of illegal trespassing by HOA security guards, Sarah said, handing over the first folder. This folder contains copies of threatening letters that exceed any legal authority granted to homeowner associations under state law. Officer Rodriguez flipped through the photographs and read several of the violation notices. His expression grew more serious with each document. This folder contains evidence of selective enforcement and harassment, Sarah continued. You will notice that identical violations by other homeowners were ignored while our family was targeted systematically. The officer studied comparison photographs showing other neighbors with the same violations that had been ignored. The pattern of harassment was obvious and well documented. And this folder, Sarah said, pulling out the thickest collection of documents, contains correspondence with the State Attorney General's office, the State Regulatory Commission for Homeowner Associations, and the County District Attorney's office. Officer Rodriguez looked up sharply. You have been in contact with all these agencies. For the past 3 months, Sarah said calmly. I have been documenting systematic abuse of authority, illegal fines, harassment, intimidation, and what appears to be fraud in the collection of unauthorized fees. She handed the officer a letter on official state letterhead. Officer Rodriguez read it carefully, his eyebrows raising as he processed the contents. The Attorney General's office has been investigating this HOA, he asked. They have been waiting for sufficient evidence to justify formal action, Sarah explained. I needed the HOA to escalate their behavior to clearly illegal activities. Tonight, they provided that evidence. Officer Rodriguez looked back toward the meeting room where Karen was still ranting to his partner. You set this up. I gave them every opportunity to behave legally, Sarah said. They chose escalation and intimidation instead. When Karen called 911 tonight, she committed filing a false police report. When she used security guards to threaten me for asking legal questions, she committed harassment under color of authority. The officer was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Sarah had just revealed. You are a lawyer, he said. It was not a question. Former corporate attorney, Sarah confirmed, specialized in regulatory compliance and institutional fraud. Officer Rodriguez walked back into the meeting room with Sarah behind him. Karen immediately began demanding that Sarah be arrested for disrupting their meeting. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your authority as HOA president, Officer Rodriguez said to Karen. Our authority comes from the covenants, Karen said impatiently. We have every right to enforce community standards. Under what specific state statute do you have authority to fine homeowners? The officer asked. Karen looked confused by the question. We do not need state statutes. We are the homeowner association. Ma'am, all enforcement authority must derive from state law, Officer Rodriguez explained. HOA covenants cannot grant you police powers. That was the moment when Karen realized she might be in serious trouble. Her confident aggression began crumbling as she faced actual legal scrutiny for the first time. Officer Park began questioning the other board members about their enforcement procedures. None of them could cite any legal authority for their actions. They had been operating on assumed power rather than actual law. We need to see your documentation of enforcement procedures, Officer Rodriguez said. The board members looked at each other nervously. They had no legal documentation because they had no legal authority. Meanwhile, Sarah sat quietly in her chair, watching the board members realize they had walked into a trap. Her months of preparation were finally paying off. Every aggressive action they had taken against homeowners was now evidence of their illegal behavior. "I think we need to contact some additional authorities," Officer Rodriguez said quietly to his partner. Karen Mitchell was beginning to understand that calling the police had been the biggest mistake of her life. Within 48 hours, Willowbrook Estates looked like the scene of a white-collar crime investigation. State regulatory authorities arrived in unmarked sedans and began conducting interviews with homeowners. The HOA office was sealed with official tape, while investigators examined financial records and enforcement documentation. Sarah had not just been building a case against Karen Mitchell. She had been coordinating with multiple government agencies to expose systematic abuse affecting the entire community. Her legal expertise had helped her identify patterns of fraud and harassment that individual homeowners could never have recognized. The State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division took over the investigation. They discovered that Karen had been collecting illegal fines for violations that exceeded any authority granted under state law. Homeowners had paid thousands of dollars in penalties that had no legal basis. Financial investigators found evidence of kickbacks between HOA board members and preferred contractors. Karen had been steering community maintenance contracts to companies that provided her with personal benefits. The security company that had been harassing homeowners was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. Other neighborhood victims finally found the courage to come forward. The Johnsons, who had been forced to sell their home, provided evidence of Karen's threats and illegal foreclosure attempts. The Martinez family shared recordings of Karen's harassment calls and false reports to Child Protective Services. Sarah emerged as the whistleblower who had made the entire investigation possible. Her methodical documentation and legal expertise had given authorities the evidence they needed to pursue criminal charges. "How did you know to contact all these different agencies?" I asked Sarah as we watched investigators photograph HOA documents. "Each agency handles different aspects of HOA abuse," she explained. "Consumer protection handles illegal fines. Housing authorities handle harassment and discrimination. The district attorney handles fraud and corruption. I needed to build cases on multiple fronts simultaneously." The scope of Karen's crimes expanded as investigators dug deeper. They found evidence that she had been embezzling HOA funds for personal expenses. Community money intended for maintenance and improvements had been diverted to Karen's personal accounts. Karen and her board members desperately tried to claim everything had been a misunderstanding. They hired lawyers and began deleting emails and shredding documents. But Sarah had already provided investigators with copies of everything they needed. "The beautiful thing about systematic abuse," Sarah told me, "is that it creates systematic evidence." Karen was so confident in her power that she documented her own crimes. State housing authorities began interviewing homeowners who had been too afraid to complain previously. They discovered that Karen had been targeting minority families and elderly residents with particularly aggressive harassment. The investigation expanded to include civil rights violations. The community transformation was remarkable. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for months began talking to each other openly. The fear that had kept everyone isolated was replaced by shared anger at how they had been treated. "I cannot believe she got away with this for so long," our neighbor Bob said during one of many impromptu gatherings that began happening as people realized they were safe to speak freely. She got away with it because she isolated everyone, Sarah explained. Bullies depend on keeping their victims separated. Once people start talking to each other, the abuse becomes obvious. Federal investigators joined the state authorities when they discovered that Karen had been filing false reports with multiple government agencies. Her calls to Child Protective Services, building inspectors, and other authorities constituted fraud and abuse of government resources. The investigation revealed that Willowbrook Estates had become a testing ground for HOA tyranny. Karen had been using increasingly aggressive tactics to see how far she could push homeowners before they fought back. She had turned community governance into a personal dictatorship. Multiple agencies were now involved in what had become the largest HOA abuse investigation in state history. Sarah's patience and strategic thinking had transformed a neighborhood dispute into a landmark case of institutional corruption. The arrests began on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the disastrous HOA meeting. I watched from our living room window as Karen Mitchell was led from her house in handcuffs, while news cameras recorded every moment. Her face was pale and drawn, a dramatic contrast to the confident tyrant who had terrorized our neighborhood for years. Karen faced multiple felony charges including fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and abuse of authority. The district attorney's office had built their case around Sarah's meticulous documentation and the evidence gathered during the multi-agency investigation. Each board member who had participated in Karen's schemes faced their own criminal charges. The financial restitution ordered by the court was staggering. Karen was required to repay over $200,000 in illegal fines collected from homeowners over 3 years. Families who had been driven from their homes received compensation for their losses and legal expenses. The corrupt HOA structure was completely dissolved by state authorities. A court-appointed administrator took over community management, while new leadership was elected under strict oversight. The days of unchecked HOA power in Willowbrook Estates were over forever. But the victory came with a personal cost that I had not anticipated. The stress of fighting Karen's harassment while secretly building a legal case had taken a tremendous toll on Sarah. She had carried the weight of dozens of families suffering while maintaining perfect composure and strategic focus. I kept thinking about all the people she had hurt, Sarah told me one evening as we watched the sunset from our back porch. Every night, I would think about the Johnson family having to sell their home, or the Martinez children being investigated by child services because of Karen's lies. The community celebrated Sarah as a hero, but she struggled with the emotional aftermath of the battle. She had spent months absorbing hatred and aggression while building her case, and the stress had affected her more deeply than she had admitted even to herself. "You saved this entire neighborhood," I reminded her. "Karen would still be terrorizing families if you had not stopped her." "I know," Sarah said quietly, "but I also know what it cost us. The sleepless nights, the constant stress, the fear that my plan might not work and we would lose everything." The transformation of our community was remarkable. Neighbors who had lived in fear for years began organizing social events and working together on genuine improvements. The new HOA leadership focused on service rather than punishment, working with homeowners instead of against them. Property values increased as word spread that Willowbrook Estates had reformed its governance. Families who had been considering leaving decided to stay. New residents moved in specifically because they had heard about our community's commitment to reasonable and legal HOA management. Sarah received recognition from state authorities for her role in exposing institutional abuse. The Attorney General's office asked her to consult on other HOA abuse cases across the state. Her strategic approach became a model for how communities could fight back against tyrannical homeowner associations. The key was understanding that Corinne's power was entirely psychological. Sarah explained to a group of homeowners from another community who were facing similar abuse. HOA bullies depend on fear and isolation. Once you challenge their legal authority and document their abuse, their entire system collapses. The national media attention brought Sarah consulting requests from across the country. Communities dealing with abusive HOA leadership wanted to learn from her successful strategy. She had developed a replicable system for fighting institutional abuse through legal documentation and multi-agency coordination. But perhaps the most important change was in our marriage. Watching Sarah's brilliant strategic mind work to protect our community had given me a deeper appreciation for her intelligence and courage. She had sacrificed her peaceful retirement to fight a battle that needed to be fought. "I married a corporate lawyer," I told her one morning as we worked together in our garden, "but I fell in love with a community protector." Sarah smiled and squeezed my hand. "I just gave Corinne Mitchell exactly what she wanted," she said. "A fight. She just did not realize she was fighting someone who actually knew how to win." The legal precedent set by Sarah's case changed HOA enforcement across our entire state. New regulations required HOA boards to demonstrate legal authority for all enforcement actions. Homeowners gained new rights and protections against abusive association leadership. Corinne Mitchell was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. Her conviction sent a message to HOA bullies everywhere that their behavior would no longer be tolerated. 2 years later, Willowbrook Estates had become a model community for how homeowner associations should operate. The new HOA board, elected by homeowners rather than appointed by developers, focused on maintaining property values through cooperation and communication rather than fear and punishment. Our neighborhood social events drew families from surrounding communities who wanted to see how former enemies had become genuine neighbors. Children played freely in yards that had once been scrutinized for violations. Homeowners made improvements to their properties without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. Sarah's legal victory had ripple effects far beyond our community. The precedent established by her case led to state legislation strengthening homeowner rights and limiting HOA authority. Other communities used her strategy to challenge their own abusive associations, creating a movement of suburban legal reform. "I never expected to become an accidental activist," Sarah told a reporter who was writing about the nationwide impact of our HOA battle. "I just wanted to protect my family and neighbors from a bully who had gotten out of control." Sarah's consulting work grew into a full-time practice, helping communities fight institutional abuse. She developed training programs for homeowners and created legal resources that made her strategy accessible to families who could not afford expensive attorneys. The personal growth that came from our shared struggle strengthened our marriage in unexpected ways. Watching Sarah's strategic brilliance and moral courage had given me a deeper understanding of the woman I had married. She had risked everything to protect people she barely knew, and her willingness to fight for justice had inspired me to be a better person. "You could have just paid the fines and kept quiet," I said to Sarah as we celebrated our wedding anniversary in the same community center where she had sprung her trap on Corinne Mitchell. "No, I could not," Sarah replied. Once I understood the scope of what Karen was doing to families, staying quiet would have made me complicit in her abuse. Our relationship with our neighbors evolved from fearful isolation to genuine community. Bob, who had once crossed the street to avoid talking to us, became one of our closest friends. The Martinez family invited us to their children's birthday parties. The Johnsons, who had moved back to the neighborhood after receiving restitution, hosted regular barbecues that brought everyone together. Sarah's work attracted attention from legal scholars who studied her systematic approach to fighting institutional abuse. Law schools began using her case as an example of how individual citizens could challenge corrupt authority through strategic legal action and multi-agency coordination. The most important lesson, Sarah told students at a legal symposium, is that bullies depend on their victims staying isolated and uninformed. Once people understand their rights and work together, even the most entrenched abuse can be overcome. The lasting change in our community went beyond governance reform. We had learned that ordinary people could fight institutional corruption and win when they used intelligence, patience, and legal strategy. Our victory proved that suburban tyranny was not inevitable, that communities could choose cooperation over intimidation. Karen Mitchell served her full sentence and moved to another state after her release. Her name became synonymous with HOA abuse in legal circles, a cautionary tale about what happens when small-scale power corrupts absolutely. As I write this story, Sarah continues her consulting work with communities across the country. She has helped dozens of neighborhoods challenge abusive HOA leadership and implement reasonable governance systems. Her strategic approach has become a model for fighting institutional bullying in suburban America. The experience taught us that justice requires preparation, patience, and the courage to fight battles that seem impossible to win. Sarah's brilliant trap had given Karen Mitchell exactly what she wanted, a confrontation with a homeowner she thought she could intimidate. Karen just never realized she was fighting someone who had spent months preparing for that exact moment, someone who understood that the best revenge against a bully is simply giving them enough rope to hang themselves.